See, I think God always starts with our identity. When we start with who we are, we know what to do. Listen to one more verse. We didn't look at this last week, but this is one of my life verses that I want you to see this pattern, to just really get this as we set our course for this morning. It's Paul writing to the church at Corinth, and he writes this. He says, "For I am the least of the apostles and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me." Now, there is so much here that I want to draw our attention to. Now, first, we see Paul immediately goes against this narrative that Batman fell prey to, right? That narrative that I am what I do, or what I do defines who I am. Right out of the gates, we need to imagine, what if Paul bought that? What if Paul thought, I am only the sum of my actions? What if Paul thought, what I do determines who I am? His resume, before being saved by Jesus, before being given this new identity, was not all that rosy. What he says is, I persecuted the church. Now that is one of the most euphemistic things in the Bible. To say I persecuted the church is really soft-pedaling it. You might remember from our study through the first chunk of the book of Acts that when Stephen was stoned, they took his things and they went and laid them at the feet of a guy named Saul. You know what Paul's name was before it was Paul? Saul. Paul is saying, I'm not even worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. What he's really saying is, I sanctioned the killing of Christians. If Paul said, I am no more than what I do determines who I am, Paul would have never really been Paul. He would have been stopped dead in his tracks by what he did, but he didn't buy it. He let God give him a new identity. He let God determine who he was, and therefore he went on to do incredible things. What does Paul say? He says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. Paul starts with identity. Paul says, whoever God says I am, that's who I am. Paul says, I'm the product of divine initiative, of the grace of God. There's no work outside what God has done that can earn my status. And now, this is where things get really interesting. Because Paul, of all people in the New Testament, says, you are saved by grace, not by works. That probably sounds familiar. But what does he say happens? He says, by the grace of God, I am what I am. So far, that seems very Pauline, right? And his grace to me was not without effect. So after all this grace upon grace, what was the effect of that grace in the life of Paul? No, I worked harder than all of them. Now, what's going on here? Is he going against what he said, that you're saved by grace through faith? No. I think what Paul is doing is a great gift to us. Because what Paul is doing is making grace and works not incompatible. But mind you, the order that you put them in and the intent behind your works really matters. See, for Paul, grace always comes first. This is something that is freely given. It's not, and when he works, it's not him paying God back. It's not him creating something that amounts to more salvation for himself. This is the natural response of someone who is so aware that they have been saved by grace. Because Paul knows that, because how does he end this section? He says, yet not I, but the grace of God that was within me. Grace for Paul comes first and comes last. But in the middle, the natural response to what God has done in your behalf is doing things in the kingdom of God. In some way, I think Paul is making works safe again. What he's saying is, actually, the safest people to be working really hard in the kingdom of God are people that know that they're saved by grace. Because those are the people that will be least likely to get confused of what their hard work is doing. Their hard work is this natural outworking of being someone saved by grace. Dallas Willard is famous, at least only to me, for saying this. He says, we must act. grace as opposed to earning, not effort. Do you see what he's saying? Grace doesn't say never do anything for the kingdom. Don't just take your salvation and let it sit idle until one day, way off in the future, you feel like you need it. Grace isn't meant to be that thing that paralyzes us. Grace is meant to be the thing that catalyzes good works in our lives for the kingdom. See, this idea that identity is the best way to lead into good actions is not only true, I think, in the Christian world, that God starts with the identity and who you are determines what you do. This is true just out there in the world. One of the things I love, if you know me at all, is I just love finding God's truth in other places, oftentimes secular sources. And I've mentioned this before, but there's a researcher named Christopher Bryan. And he was, where was he? He used to be at Stanford. Now he's at the Chicago School of Business. And he studies this kind of stuff. He studies identity and how it shapes our actions. And he was interested to see if that relationship was actually true. Not a Christian guy, just a guy who is a psychologist that studies what people are like. So is this whole identity first, actions second thing just true out there in the way the world works? And the reason why I love stuff like this is because I think every person is made in the image of God. Not everybody is adopted in the family of God, but every person is made in God's image. So I think if we find this true in people, this really is kind of the way that God has made us. So in 2008, he did this simple sounding experiment that led to some profound results. It was leading up to the 2008 election, and he polled people, and he asked them one of two questions, kind of this randomized study. And the two questions were this. To some, he said, how important is it to you to vote in the upcoming election? And to others, he asked something that sounds so similar. How important is it to you to be a voter in the upcoming election? Now, if you look at it, they're real close, but there's a difference. In the first, he's asking, how important is it to this person to do something, to vote? In the second, he says, how important is it to you to be something, to be a voter? If you go to the next slide, we'll make it real clear. To vote is something I do. To be a voter is something I am. Now, if identity leads to action better than anything else, and if identity better predicts action, which one of these, the first or the second, do you think predicts more voting? Second. Fantastic. If you go to the next slide, when they were asked to do something, 56% voted. When they were asked to be something, 88% voted. Now, that may seem like, okay, do you know how small a change that is to produce that size results? The psychological community was like, lose their jaws, hit the ground. Because all we have to do is switch a couple words and tap into identity rather than action, and we can do that. Could you imagine the kind of results this would lead to if voters for a certain political party were motivated in this way? You could imagine how terrifying it would be to the other party. That if they really said voting is part of who I am, it's not just I vote, I am a voter. Maybe one way to think about it is that nouns create verbs. Maybe one other way, just to get this in our brains, identity creates action. Now, if this is the way people are, the church ought to take attention. Because sometimes we think, hey, I'm going to show up to church and worship today. What if we said, I'm a worshiper. It's just who I am. It's not just what I do on Sunday when Matt tells me to. It's who I am every day. It's who I am all days of the week. What if we said, and you're asking yourself, right, turn of the year, maybe you're looking at your budgets, how important is it for me to give? I'm a giver. What must I do to be that? You can go down that list. And this morning, in the balance of our time, we're going to look at 4 identities that I think help shape who we are as New Community Church. And I hope as we look at these together, that you might be able to ask yourself, do I identify with these? Am I able to say, I am all these things? And the 4 we'll look at this morning are this. I am a connector, I am a learner, I am a servant, and I am a leader. See, I think if we can own those identities, we are more likely to act in line with them. If we just look at our lives as a long list of to-dos, I think we'll fall short. But if we can shape our identity around the things that are important to God, I think we have a chance to really live out the Christian life. Well, first, I am a connector. Listen to this word from the book of Hebrews. It says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, I think connecting, being in community, is really core at our identity. It's in our name, right? This is really important. We are New Community Church. But I think, and again, you hear some of the things, some of the lingo we use, right? I think Joel said it. I say I love the church every time I'm up here, but every time Joel's up here, I think what he says is discipleship is catalyzed from the pulpit, but it's maximized in community. Do I get that right? Awesome, right? Right? So I think community is at the heart of who we are as a church, but it's not because we just thought it was a good idea. Community is actually at the heart of who God is. God, at his identity, is a community. You've maybe heard us talk about this before. God is three persons with one essence. He is this divine community of love. And there's no start to God, so just kind of the ground of reality, God himself is a community of love and encouragement. And we, this whole church, are a community full of image bearers. So if we want to be like God, we need to be people that are rooted in community. And this community is important to the writer of the book of Hebrews. Listen, as he writes, he just assumes that the people he's writing to will be in community. Let us, it's plural right out of the gates, that they would be with one another. But he tells them to be with one another in a particular way. He says, definitely gather. But what he says is, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Now, the writer of Hebrews is using a provocative term here. Another way, that spur on, maybe we don't say that much, but you know what word we do use that is just as good a translation? Provoke. Now, what I find so interesting is normally we're talking about two opposing parties provoking one another. Like if you were to think about how communities provoke, you might think about the political landscape, right? You might think about Republicans provoking Democrats or the other way around. Rarely do you think of one community provoking itself. But the writer of Hebrews wants to use a word that has some force to it, that has some oomph to it, that gets some action going. He wants you and I to be in the kind of community that provokes each other, that spurs action towards love and good deeds. See, that's the kind of community that I think we are to be a part of. And what is amazing is this book of Hebrews, written very early on in the Christian community, is already experiencing Lone Ranger Christianity. They might not have called it that, but they're already experiencing, not that long after the death of Jesus, not that far into the birth of the church, they are already experiencing people giving up on meeting together. And they probably know what you and I know, is when you gather together, there's always something else you could be doing. And the people that you're with sometimes are weird, right? Community can be tough. And very early on into the experience of the Christian church, they find people are giving up on meeting together. They had to fix the wheels on their chariot or hem their toga. I don't know what they were doing. Or tunic. Toga? Where is this? Right? But already they're experiencing that. And the writer is saying, don't give up. See, here in New Community Church, we want you not to give up. We want you to see yourselves as I am a connector. Maybe for you, that's coming to church on Sunday. And that's just how you approach being here. That I'm coming, yes, to worship God. I'm coming, to lead my family in their faith. I'm also coming to connect. I'm going to look around and see people and make friends. Maybe it's how you go to cafe afterwards, that it's not just for the cup of coffee, but you were kind of on the prowl, right? You're the social predator looking around. Is there somebody new? I'm going to chase them to their car. I've done that. It's great. It's terrifying for everybody, but it's great for me. Maybe you are just looking around and saying, is there somebody that's standing alone? Is there somebody that needs a friend? Maybe I've heard stories of people saying, hey, I saw somebody new, took them to lunch. invited them over to my house. I just want them to feel connected. We actually one time got the feedback, your church is too friendly. You know what? I'll take it. If we're going to err in one direction, I'd rather err in that. Asking people to be connected into community more than allowing people to just check in and check out. All right, second, we want you to say, I am a learner. Listen to this verse. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, as soon as I say, I want you to say, I am a learner, it's easy to get exhausted. You might have pictures of like sitting in class. You might have pictures of long hours of reading. You might have flashbacks of like microeconomics or organic chemistry and say like, I think I'm done with the learning phase of my life. But I want to broaden the way we see this. I don't want this to be a call to heap on more and more stuff to make you exhausted. See, listen to the way Jesus talks about learning from him. The first thing he says is, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. If you feel like you're carrying too much, if you feel like you're troubled, if you feel like you're having a hard time, if you're fatigued or tired or pessimistic, if you look at your life and it doesn't seem all that rosy to you, you are qualified to come to Jesus. Jesus invites all those for whom life can be a struggle sometimes. It's as if he's saying, the qualification to come to me is weariness and being burdened. And the call first is to barely do anything. The first thing he says is, come to me. All he wants you to do is come to me. And rather than starting with, and I'm going to heap on all this stuff to do, all these things to learn, what does he say? Come to me and I will give you rest. Jesus is saying, the first thing I want you to do in a posture of being a learner is come to me and I will restore your weary and burdened soul. But it's surprising because next he says, take my yoke upon you. Now, if you know anything about yokes are a work instrument. It's a thing you sling on an oxen so they can pull this plow and do lots of work. For a rabbi like Jesus was, it was taking on this whole body of teaching, this way of being in the world. What's wild is he's saying, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. And then I'm going to put this work instrument on your shoulders. It seems surprising. What you probably wanted was, no, like say, come to me and I'll give you a vacation. Come to me and I'll give you a comfier mattress, right? Come to me and I'll give you a nap. But Jesus says, come to me and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. A yoke, if you had a yoke on and you were sitting down, you were using it wrong. This is a call to action. And yet somehow, in the midst of it, Jesus is saying this is the best way to find rest. It's as if Jesus is saying, listen, have you ever heard the expression like, lay your burdens at the door and come in? I try not to say that because I don't think it's realistic. I think everybody sitting in the seats today has burdens. What I think Jesus is offering is a yoke to carry them better. Jesus is a realist. He's saying people's lives don't stop once they become a Christian, but I want to give you a way to carry your life in a fresh way that feels more restful. And don't worry. In a very real way, I've already done all the work ahead of you. And yes, you'll need to put your hand to the plow. You'll need to take that yoke upon you. You will have some hard work, but the bulk of it, the real work that matters, has already been done before you take on the yoke. See, I think here we have the chance to be learners. Now again, maybe that starts here. Maybe it's just the way you approach Sunday services. Maybe this isn't just a lift. Maybe this is you're saying, I want to learn how to be someone following Jesus in his kingdom that is alive and well now. Maybe it's just the way one of my favorite, I want to always say 8 things at once, so I really have to order my brain. But maybe that's a way you approach some of your commitments already. Maybe as you serve, maybe as you're in a small group, maybe as you're in a Bible study, you just say, man, this is my time to learn. I want to know what Jesus is like and how to live like him. But maybe this is the way that you start to see your whole life. See, one of my favorite expressions is all of life is discipleship. There's no part of your life that doesn't qualify as a thing that can teach you. And I think that's one of the thrills of following Jesus, is he goes with you all the time as your teacher. And if you take the posture of a learner, he'll tell you what is going on as you go through your life. It's one of the greatest thrills of my life is to walk through life and say, God must have something for me in this. So I want you to be able to say, I'm a connector. I want you to be able to say, I'm a learner. I also want you to be able to say, I am a servant. Listen to the way that Paul starts one of the longest, most significant works in the New Testament. He says this, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. Now, when Paul went to introduce himself, he could have done so in a variety of ways, but listen to how he chose. He said, I am a servant of Jesus Christ. He leads with an identifying marker that no one would have valued in that day and age. But Paul says, as his pitch to get people involved with the movement of Jesus, as one of the chief representatives of it, he says, I'm a servant, a slave of Jesus Christ. What that meant is that they were submitting to the will of God. But it wasn't just that. He also says he's called as an apostle. These people, apostles, were specifically Christian. There was no way to get confused about who they were. They were commissioned and called and sent out with authority. And they represented Christ in the world. And so Paul says, I have this really unique identity as a servant of Jesus Christ, but also this empowered apostle, called and commissioned and sent to make a difference in the world. He goes on and says this. He says, through him, this great God in Jesus Christ, through him we received grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. And you also are among those Gentiles who are called to belong to Jesus Christ. He says, I am a servant first and foremost. And what does it mean on my life? It means that I am called to an obedience that comes from faith. Faith in Jesus Christ always leads to you serving him obediently. I want us as a church, for us to say, who are we? We are servants. Maybe that sounds like a lowly title, but in Jesus' world, the last shall be first. So we had to own that and own that confidently. I want us to be able to say, we are servants. I think as you see yourself as a servant, as you own that, you say, I am a servant. It's just something I do every once in a while. That's who I am. I am a servant. You will find ways to serve. Well, lastly, the last identity that I think defines who we are as a church is being a leader. It says, For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. Again, right out of the gates, we see that Paul is saying, I am defined by grace. Grace is why I am what I am. But he goes on a few verses later to say this. He says, we all have different gifts, according to the grace given each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophecy in accordance with your faith. If it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. See, Paul is building out what he calls the body of Christ. And he's saying that all the different parts of the body need one another. And you could be mistaken to look at this and say, well, you're saying I'm supposed to say I am a leader. But if I look at that, I see a lot of other identities that maybe I could have. And leading just seems one among many options, right? That little line, if it is to lead, do it diligently. So maybe, Adam, I don't see myself as a leader. I don't know if that's one. Hey, I'll be part of a team. I'll just be doing my own deal. I'll contribute. There are a lot of things I'll do. But leadership, yeah, that's the one that I'm not sure I need to do. Now, let me tell you what I think Paul is saying here. And I think maybe a better way to see leadership. See, I think leadership, when it's set in this context, is really about two things. It's about discovery and responsibility. I think leadership need not have to be, I'm the president of whatever organization. Leadership could be that I am on this journey to discover how God has made me and what I'm good at, and then take responsibility for finding ways to give those gifts back. I think that's what leadership really looks like. There's only so many heads of organizations, but the entire organization could be filled with leaders if they are on this path of discovery. How has God made me? What am I good at? And then taking responsibility to give that back. One of my other life verses, it won't show up on the screen, but I want to tell it to you. It's from Luke 12:48. And it says, to whom much is given, much is expected. Now, what I love about that is, one, I, from a very young age, have always seen myself as someone to whom much has been given. And so I feel on the hook all the time. Much is required. But what I think is so fascinating about that verse is it requires leadership to get done. Because the much I need to discover. That much that God has. You can look at your life sometimes and think, meh, it feels pretty average. Have I really been given much? Like, I've been given some stuff, but is it much? I think to whom much is given requires leadership to look at your life and say, I have been given a lot. How do I need to take responsibility for it and give it back? I think when we say, I am a leader, it's that process. It's discovering how God has made you, who God has made you, and then taking responsibility for that beautiful identity you have in Christ, and then giving it back to his great world. See, New Community Church, I think who we are involves at least 4, and there's probably more identities. I am a connector, I am a learner, I am a servant, and I am a leader. I think if we embrace those identities, our church will be filled with such glorious, restful, beautiful activity that the world won't be able to miss what God is doing through this place.